All right, greetings, everybody. We're going to take a moment or two to get our members signed in here, and then we'll get ourselves kicked off. Another 30 seconds, and we'll be off and running. So just let's let a few more folks join in. All right, I think we are good to go. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, depending on where you're at. And welcome to the third Battery Soundbites webinar. I'm your co-host today, Bill Binch, and I'm enthusiastic about today's session. But before I dive into our speakers that are going to be joining me today, let me first share a couple of items. Number one, we'll be having our fourth Soundbites coming up on Wednesday, April 12th. We'll be joined by Michelle Benfer, who's the Senior Vice President of Sales at HubSpot. She's an incredible revenue leader, so I'm looking forward to that. And we'll have emails with details on how to sign up for that coming out shortly. Secondly, Battery will be hosting a CRO-focused sales event in New York City coming up on March 23rd. This is an event that's focused on how companies are driving sales efficiency inside of their revenue organizations right now. So if you are a CRO or a head of sales and you're in the New York City area on March 23rd, we'd love to have you. Feel free to email me if you're interested in more details. My email is bbinch, B-B-I-N-C-H, @battery.com, and I'll get those over to you. But let's shift over to the real stars of the show today. Like I said, I'm enthusiastic because number one, this is the first Soundbites where I have a co-host, and I'll first introduce that person. Joining me today is Neeraj Agrawal, a 23-year veteran of Battery, a Bostonite, and a good friend. He and I have been working together for over a dozen years together. So welcome, Neeraj.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill, for having me. I'm excited to hear from Abe and learn all the interesting lessons he's learned over his career here.
Yeah, I was thinking about today when you said 23 years at Battery, that I've known you for about half of those now. Neeraj and I worked together first when he made an investment at Marketo, where I spent about 10 years. And then he was the person that introduced me to my next role, CRO, at Pendo, where I spent about 3 years before coming and joining up with him here at Battery. So like I said, a good 13, 14-year history together. But let's shift to the real star of the show today. We have a person that's joining us that firstly and most importantly, I call a friend. This is a person that I lean to when I'm in need of ideas, when I want to bounce a topic off, and it's a value that I really find great in talking with Abe. So joining us today is Abe Smith, who is the head of international for Zoom. And Abe, I'll give a quick little rundown on your background just to set the table a little bit.
Sure.
Abe is also a Bostonian. Neeraj went to Harvard, lives there. I had the fortune of living there for 7 years. Abe's born there. Abe's a true Bostonian, went to UMass at Amherst, spent your first 6 or 7 years of your career cutting your teeth there in the market before making your way west, where what I would describe as a pivotal move for you of joining a small video company called WebEx, where we're going to talk a little bit about some of your experience that you gained there. Rode that through the Cisco acquisition, and then moved after that to a company called Mindjet, where he and I had the fortune of meeting and building our relationship from. There, Abe went and joined an organization called Badgeville, where he met a key person in his career named Kevin Ackroyd. Kevin then hired Abe into Oracle's marketing cloud, and then again hired Abe to run international for Cision, where you lived in London, before making the move back to the States yet again to join up with Eric Yuan and the Zoom team. Eric, who you had obviously met from your WebEx days,
Right.
brought you back in to run international for Zoom a little over 4 years ago, if I get the rundown correctly. That sound about right?
It's like a page from This Is Your Life. So thank you. Yeah, it's accurate. And thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah,
Real pleasure
like I
to be on
said,
the
Abe,
show.
I always value our conversations. When I was putting sound bites together, you were on that list of the people that were on the must-have for guests. So thank you for taking the time out today.
It's my pleasure. Great to be here. Hey, go Pats, go Red
Right on.
Sox for Neeraj. So I have to
Awesome.
gotta put up a plug for the hometown.
Yeah,
Neeraj is from Queens, though. So Neeraj, who do you?
Oh,
I've been in Boston 25 years now. Then my kids are Boston fans, so Celtics and Bruins right now.
just have a choice. Yeah, exactly.
Well, good. Well, Abe, before we dive into the business side of who you
Sure.
are, let's stay back in the Boston, the formative years a bit. Obviously, you have a tremendous amount of international and global experience that we're going to touch on today. But that all started back a little earlier in you developing what I'd consider an appetite for international when you went over to Japan and
Right.
taught English over there. Love to hear a little bit about how that came about. How'd you learn Japanese? What was that process?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thanks for asking. So there was a couple catalyst moments. I grew up in a family that had a lot of conversation around international and government and political affairs at the dining room table. And my father was a real Chinophile and, very interested in Asian culture. And then I took it one step further. I actually studied Japanese in college. I was a political science major. I got a certificate in international relations. So it was something that always just interested me personally. And I focused and gravitated more towards Asian history and the languages and so forth. Serendipity gave a chance to go to a small fishing village in southern Japan in Kyushu and work for a Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Education and Foreign Affairs, teaching English. But the real gem of the experience was a chance to just immerse myself in a culture and get to know a place at a very intimate level, not as a tourist, better understand the people, the places, the food, the religion, the thinking, etc. And then, it was very inspirational for me. And, when I got back from Japan, I knew immediately that I wanted to do something around international business. I just didn't know what. And, I think the best advice I got when I returned to the United States was, it's wonderful that you're interested in Asia, and it's great that you've got this enthusiasm for the international markets, but you got to be, a specialist in something. And what's your 10,000 hours? And long story, but I gravitated towards sales and marketing, and I built my 10,000 hours in the world of cloud and software and computing. And then I merged the passions. I guess you could say I merged the passions.
Yeah, you kind of pre-answered my question that I was going to ask about, which was you returned from that trip. You clearly saw that international was going to be some component of your future. So fast forward a few years in your working career, it seems like your time at WebEx, where you started off as a rep, moved yourself up, but then you got the opportunity to delve into that international element. Was that a key arc of your career?
Yeah, it always was. I mean, so, for me, at a personal and professional level, it was staying focused on what I wanted to do. And I always knew that this is exactly what I wanted to do. So when people ask me, like, do you aspire to be a chief revenue officer or president or CEO? And while all those things are really interesting, to me, this is the pinnacle. I actually set my sights on running international, having a broad purview across the world, and then doing exactly what I'm doing now. So, but it started, like you said, when I was in a company like WebEx, which was growing quickly, it was really identifying opportunities and raising hands where, I was managing a Northeast team. I went from rep to managing a territory. And then somebody on my team said, hey, look, we get all these leads that come in from Latin America. I happen to speak Spanish. You want to help me develop the region? And that was honestly probably the first international assignment where we said, you know what, let's go do this. Let's actually tackle it, not in a way that, adds little bits and bytes, but adds maybe real meaning to the company. And that one rep became five became a team. And then slowly but surely, we started to build out Latin America, and then had the opportunity to grow out Asia Pacific and other parts of emerging markets and broader parts of the world for WebEx. So, I think part of it, professionally on the pursuit, it's really being true to the craft, and then, merging again the idea of the skill, which was understanding how to build high growth sales teams and focus on the revenue, and then diversifying to a way that allowed a complete go-to-market and establishing teams that could really succeed in any part of the world.
Maybe to chime in there, I don't know if Bill, if I can do that on this one, but just what I find, we have, a lot of companies get to the 50 to 100 million range roughly, and they start thinking about international. And what I find really interesting, Abe, in the way you have it set up at Zoom, and it seems like a lot of different backgrounds on this, like you're based in the US, you run international from here. As companies think about how to establish international, can you talk about the pros and cons of like that approach? Where do you recommend folks hire that first person? Should it be in Asia? Should it be in EMEA? How should they go about thinking around that?
It's a great question, Neeraj. And I think actually the first point that you said is probably the most important part to think about is that first $50 million. So, as a company starts to bridge past the first 10, they're getting feet on their ground, and actually they're executing well in the United States, which is number one. Let's be clear. I think for a lot of SaaS companies, you got to do it right here in the United States. That's the critical market, and we all appreciate that. Before you can start to think about the quixotic adventures around the world, and how you enter Asia and what you think about in Europe and so forth, I think it's getting the house and the foundation right in the U.S. From there, it's like, what we found and what I've seen in companies like WebEx and Zoom and other places, even like Badgeville, where we were just cresting past that $10 million mark, you start to see signals where there was interest. If the company is really getting that foundation right, there's interest that organically starts to happen. And that usually happens in leads, or that happens, with an inquiry or people coming to a webinar or whatever the case may be. And then the first question that you ask is, do those signals allow you a way to start to think about it more logically and start to address it in a way that makes a lot of sense for the company? In places like WebEx, as I just mentioned, a couple of minutes ago, you had that one person in the team that spoke a foreign language, that wanted to stay up late or get up early. And you know what? That's a great place to start. In the case of Zoom, I was really interested to see when I joined the company, I joined the company around $250 million. And, in that first 50 to 100 and so forth, something interesting really happened, which I'd never seen before, is the establishment of a team called ROW, which don't ever name your team this, because it's called Rest of World. And it's a little bit, it's a little bit derogatory if you think about it. It's like US and everywhere else.
Yes.
But from the ROW perspective, there was just a land of the misfit toys, a hodgepodge of reps that said, I'll stay up late. I speak, Farsi, I speak, Japanese. I happen to know a little bit of Arabic, etc. And these were very, intelligent go-getter reps that said, I'm willing to help develop this. Now, bear in mind, the go-to-market was all in English, and, the hours are a little bit ragtag, and, the go-to-market wasn't exactly perfected. However, it was shocking how many deals actually converted, and then how it started to build a foundation for, the first account, the second account. So when we actually started to think about, when I entered the business of thinking about, okay, how do we go into these markets? Zoom had already hired those first, you could say, key nationals. So like many traditional cloud companies, it was a national in the UK and it was a national in Australia. And they were able to start to think about that foundational team, the core investments, and then basically a few of the lighthouse accounts. So there was momentum that established from that early day motion in the United States. There was a handoff that was starting to happen from, I sell you domestically, though you're internationally. It was the foundation of that first national hire, that person that was a little bit of a category specialist, somewhat of an entrepreneur. In some cases, you see that happen where, somebody is sent from the United States into a market, and that can work too. In our case, we happen to have those national approaches, and that created that first foundation of UK and Australia. And, happy to talk a little bit from what happens from there. But I think as you start to think about that expansive ability, then you start to think about somebody like myself, where we're now going to programatize, and we're really going to accelerate and turn on the energy, if you will, across the world. Now, it's up to somebody like me to start to set the strategy. And at that point, the company at 250 million, 300 million, 350 million, clear path to an IPO. You have to start to think about the public markets and what it means to really be foundationally ready to diversify the business beyond the US borders. And that's where, the professionalism of an international team and international leadership, national leadership really makes a difference.
That's great. That's great. What do you think about the first set of countries, English speaking, non-English speaking? I imagine you work with a lot of folks that don't yet have international execs. Do you tend to suggest one specific spot to start with, one specific country?
It's a great question. I think, generally speaking, very cautious for, again, a US based cloud company to think about going too far into languages that they're just not ready for. Now, you might argue that a European language like French or a European language like German is in the comfort zone. I don't know. I mean, to be very honest with you, it's a temperament question, and it's around maturity of the organization, because the easiest place and the easiest way to address is English first. At least, your core collateral, your product marketing, your website, your general go-to-market, it's all translated. It's ready to go. It's in a language that you say, hey, this is a foundationally we're going to be. Now, it might not be, the Queen's English, and it might not be the mother tongue, specifically as somebody would like, but it's understood. I think where it gets a little bit tricky is when you get into aggressively localized markets too soon. And that can be Japan, that can be a Brazil, that can be a China, that can even be a Germany. It was interesting when I came to Zoom, we had one person on the ground in Germany. We were starting to address the market, and we had to make a fundamental decision. And the fundamental decision that I made at that point was, look, Germany is the fourth largest economy in the world. It's the first largest economy in Europe. We need to own this market, even though it's going to be hard. Investment will start now. So when we made that decision, there's a slew of localization and go-to-market, market entry and expansion considerations that we had to get the company around, and we had to get buy-in. And honestly, there was a really distinct buy-in that was necessary. So I caution people from being too aggressive, especially at the forefront. Get some of that English market experience right, prove it, and then the company will actually be a little bit more tolerant and start to get around you when you say, here's where I think we go next. It's harder. It's going to place more stress on the company, but I think it's worth it. And that's, those are kinds of things that we did at Zoom.
Got it, Gabe. I want to dive into the ramp, like you said, the preparation mentally that you took to go into Germany, for instance. But before we go there, a lot of people come to you seeking input, seeking advice on going global. And I've learned from talking with you that normally starts with a caution from you, that before thinking about going global, you need to think about some of the pitfalls, some of the obstacles that are going to present. Can you share some of those blockers? Like when I approach you and say, Abe, I'm at 50 million, I'm thinking about, entering Europe. What are the things that you're going to caution me to think about?
Yeah, and I get the question all the time. And, for an internationalist, I tend to be probably the most negative guy about going abroad as anybody could imagine. So it's only out of love. So I'll tell you that, first of all, if you're a CEO or you're a CRO on this call, and I'm not discouraging it. I want everybody to actually go build the world, because I think it's the most important thing you can do. And that's frankly how you build an epic company. It's not just here in the United States. So, I'll give you an example. Like, I did get the question from a CEO had raised a very sizable funding. I mean, at this point was north of 500 million in funding that was raised, and they were far along in their capital, again, in their capital raise. And very, seasoned executive, a classic big tech experience, very, very bullish on where to go. And what he had said to me is, I'm very interested in going into Japan. I want to go, I want to enter Japan. And, my question was why? First of all, your category is not even shaped in the US. You have like 2 people in Australia. That's your APAC presence. Your company has no foundational experience on how to localize. You're going to enter a market that is the most locally intense market you could potentially imagine. You're going to have to commit to educating and designing the go-to-market yourself, so that the rest of the world and your competitors can then follow suit. And then, by the way, as a CEO, you got to be prepared to make no money in that market for the next 3 years. And when your leadership and your sales reps tell you that they're not going to sell anything for year number 1 or year number 2, I hope you're okay with that. And he was like, well, I think we need to do it because we're going to go public soon. I was like, well, first of all, you're not going public this year. No offense. But I guess, the moral of the story was, really ask yourself where and why. Now, there could be some great reasons. Like I think in many cases, there could be founders on this call or CEOs or CROs that have very deep experience in a country. Like, Freshworks has a very strong background in India, or, Hiro-san from Treasure Data was a Japanese entrepreneur. Erdogan, our CEO, has rich and deep experience in China. We had, presence and strength there. And that gives you an advantage where if you're able to capitalize on that, that's an absolutely unique advantage, and you should consider that. I think what you really have to contemplate, though, is what's the stress it's going to put on the company? Is the company ready for it? And is the award or reward worth the vital few that you're forsaking elsewhere? So when you make a decision to go into a market, it's not a tepid decision. You're in. And, there's not a lot of going back unless you literally divorce yourself from the market and you pull out. So I think, what people have to realize is they're making a commitment that has to have longevity, and that comes with some seriousness.
Maybe just add to the what commitments do you ask from your CEO or other executives before doing that? Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's it's a thoughtful question too, because both at Oracle and here at Zoom, we put together a unique team. It's a bit of a tiger team, which not a lot of companies have. So I'll share with you a little bit of secret sauce. Is we have a team that we built called market entry, market readiness, market entry, and market expansion. And it's a small group of individuals that think about the totality of how we have to serve a market. And that is the entire customer experience and the employee experience. So, think about it when you're ultimately building a market. Again, let's take a Japan or a Brazil or a France or a Germany or a Singapore or wherever. The customer experience would be great from the beginning, or at least get there sometime. So in other words, if I'm in Japan, I want the website in Japanese. You want to buy in yen. You want to be able to receive technical support in Japanese. You have to have billing in your local language, et cetera. So the paragon should be how to create all those things. At the minimum level, as we start to think about entry into a country nowadays, we look at somewhat of a pod structure. So, inevitably you need your AEs, and let's be clear, any CEO and any leader like myself says we got to go sell and we have to drive revenue. That's number one. The shortcoming is when you don't give enough accoutrement around the rep to at least make their job viable. So by that, I mean, it could be an SE, it could be a customer success representative, it could be the right ops person, sales ops person. There's a team of like 8, 9, or 10 when we think about a market entry that we minimalize, or we have a foundation that's pretty close nearby. So for example, we put more of a substantive position in Singapore, knowing that we were going to start to develop across ASEAN. So if you think about the hub and spoke, Singapore did become our data center. We had technical infrastructure. We have, 100 plus people there. We have an office space. We have senior leadership, et cetera. And that gave us a little bit of more fortitude as we looked into Malaysia and Indonesia, for example, knowing that we still had to have that pod entrance where the core folks could draw on the resources, but have enough critical mass to do their job. I think the mistake that a lot of people make is sometimes they say rep first, and it's a bit of a Lone Ranger scenario. They just don't have enough, and that's a recipe for disaster.
By the way, is there a certain number of reps that is enough critical mass? That's the other thing we often see is like someone will put one person in France and one in the UK and one over here. My sense is you need a little bit more than that. Can you talk about, is there, in your experience, a critical mass aspect?
I think it depends on the market too, because obviously there's a size of a market that makes a difference. Like as we started to look, for example, in Southern Europe, we were a lot more demure in like a Greece or a Turkey or a Spain or an Italy, even compared to a France, which, was a primary market for us. So, when we invest we think about scale, and frankly for us, at Zoom, the intent is actually to model the same framework that we have in the revenue organization in the United States. So for consistency, and as you think about a global organization, which I'm a part of, right? The more I start to deviate the model, unless I have to, it makes it very difficult from a reporting perspective, from just how we manage the business, the global go-to-market consistency, et cetera. So we try to emulate where we can the segments, the channel strategy, the accoutrements around the reps and so forth. So in a large market like Germany, for example, the goal is to start to scale to hundreds of people. In a smaller market, for example, like even in Mexico City, where we're a little bit more managed, that's probably 8 to 12 folks.
Got it. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Got it. Abe, I've been hearing, in addition to the classic move, that you ask some of your folks from your HQ country to move over so that they come and bring the business process, they bring the culture of the company over there. I've started to hear a lot of executives talk about their companies are investing in rotations where they're sending people a lot of times by function. Like, we're going to send a CSM over to the country for a month. We're going to send a tech support person. And that way you start through osmosis and learning. And even if, as you know, even if you don't speak the language, you find a way to communicate.
I totally agree. And in fact, you were one of the pioneers in that, Bill. You know, back in the day at Marketo, with some of the moves that you made outside the US, I was watching that because you'd rotate in some really interesting folks that could immediately add value and help, you know, bring the culture into the city, bring the expertise into the city, et cetera. So I like the concept. I mean, you know, it gets a little tricky. You know, we found a couple bumps in the road around, you know, visas and, you know, how people are coming in and out of the country and stuff like that. So, you know, it takes a little bit of doing. We want to do it, actually, believe it or not, now that we have more maturity. So, you know, what we're trying to think about is how do we prevent, now that we've got a little bit more scale and critical mass, we have an $800 million business, for example, in Europe, you know, we want to cross-pollinate more. Believe it or not, like, the business starts to get a little bit more siloed. You know, the French team hangs out with the French team, and the German team's hanging out with the German team. And, you know, we have a center of excellence in the Netherlands where there's hundreds of people and they're not intermingling. So, you know, we were thinking about this concept of like a field trips, and how do we do field trips? And how do we start to allow people to, again, spend a day or two in a city because it's so easy in a European context? Or how do we ensure, you know, even things, believe it or not, as executives that vacation or rotate into markets, you got to keep them awareness to say, hey, look, they want to see you. Like, even if it's for dinner or, you know, a quick town hall, it's real important. So
Sure. A couple more here, Abe, and then for all of our listeners, start thinking of some questions. We have a bunch that were pre-submitted. I just answered mine, but let me ask a couple more, or I'll ask one more and then give it to Neeraj to ask. But you talked about big companies like Japan and Germany, and then you talked about, you know, like you said, secondary countries like a Greece or something like that. There seems to be a philosophy out there in the international expansion mindset that sometimes there's a path of there's 5 or 6 countries that matter. I think I've heard this come out of your mouth. And then there's this more, I think, encompassing, let's go carpet the world type of perspective. Love to get your riff on those 2 points of view.
It's one, I get it. It's, you know, this is like an age-old international question that keeps me up all night. And it actually, like, years ago, I was reading, you know, Behind the Cloud, or, you know, Mark Benioff's book. And, you know, he is a big proponent of 6 countries matter and their billion-dollar markets. You know, it's a country like Japan where Alan Miner, Sunbridge, you know, created a joint venture, a legendary joint venture. You know, Ueda-san established an incredible business. You know, decades later, it's over $1 billion and extremely vibrant for Salesforce. And I applaud the discipline that is associated with being very determined on core markets, the UKs of the world, the Japans of the world, and so forth. And we emulate that in so much as what we call like a P1 structure. So we focus on priority 1 countries, and we, you know, we're assured on how we determine growth and opportunity to get to a real big number. That said, I tend to be a little bit more cavalier, and I believe in the fact that it's a big world out there. And there's massive opportunity. You know, I grew up in developing a lot of the emerging markets. There's massive opportunities right now taking place, it's a timing issue. If you can go get, you know, we just did a very material deal in the Middle East, and we have an incredible opportunity in that market. We've done some fantastic stuff in Southeast Asia. You know, we see potential even in places in Africa, you know, but I tend to look at the world and say, okay, how do we address it? And that doesn't, by the way, have to be through substantive, you know, direct sales rep deployment. It could be through really intelligent partners. In some cases, in certain markets, we have partners that have become almost like Zoom for that market. So, for example, we have a partner in Israel that became an early adopter of Zoom. They're practically Zoom Israel. You know, we had a similar structure, you know, in a market like Germany, an early partner. They're a very foundational partner in that country. So I think there's a lot to be said for diversifying with the partners and going for it. If you have the framework the discipline and the operational, confidence to say, we can go get that market, go for it.
Hey, Abe, just to chime in on this, like this, I've kind of grown up like historically thinking the 5-6 country model, and so that's the advice I tend to give, CEOs that I'm involved with. Do you think that there's a certain do you think that approach makes sense? But Zoom is a unique business, right? Zoom is like used by people all around the world. Pandemic is like, I'm sure there's, it probably looks like the global population in terms of user base.
Yeah, it does.
But a lot of B2B SaaS tends not to work that way. So I'm curious if there any lessons learned, in terms of these two different approaches I think
you're right, Neeraj. Like, look, but what I would say is that, usually when you land in a market, you do have adjacent markets. So for example, like, Germany, the DACH region then becomes your oyster. So there's no reason not to address Switzerland and Austria. We did. And, again, Zoom is you're very right. It's very conducive to just about everywhere, and it lends itself to a global audience. And we took stock in that. But I do like the fact that, when we had the right leadership in Germany, we knew we could easily address Switzerland and Austria immediately. And then we built out a structure that allowed us to address Central and Eastern Europe. They're adjacent markets. We've done a similar quadrant structure in Southern Europe where, France is now helping to lead more of the growth in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and so forth, because we can draw on resources in that quadrant.
Yeah.
So I think there's advantages to that. It's like the Singapore example also, where we were really foundationally focused on a P1 Singapore entrance and development. On the other hand, we knew that would be the catalyst for ASEAN, which has hundreds of millions of digital natives. So it depends on the product, and it depends on just how you can structure your leadership. But if you're able to, I think there's great opportunity to reach those adjacencies.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure. Last one for you before we dive into some questions. There's already a great question in the chat here. We have a few audience members here that are looking at this from the other way, which is moving into the US. So still a global expansion, but starting from somewhere outside the US.
Yeah.
What changes in that motion? In your experience, what have you seen when companies want to enter the domestic USA market?
I love this question. And, there's a few folks in my network that are really thinking about this, particularly like, in fact, we just had this conversation with a delegation from Japan, and they're all like, look, there were 18 entrepreneurs from Japan that were here on a roadshow in Silicon Valley, and they wanted to understand, hey, we all want to come into the United States market. I think it's a tall order. I mean, I think if you're going to be a world-class global company, you have to, right? So, but that said, I've seen some real struggles. I think just as Americans often don't understand the cultures and the markets that they're entering, I'd say it's the other way around. I think this market is extremely difficult. Now, first thing is, if you're lucky, go find yourself a Bill Binch who you can convince to leave Battery and run the organization for you. You didn't hear that, Neeraj? Close your ears. But you need somebody who is just an absolute, SaaS god and can really say, I am going to be your foundational, your messiah here in the United States. And I don't think, generally speaking, I don't think people find that really stellar American. Let's start there. That they can trust, obviously. The second thing is around culture and language. So I think as people come here, it's expected that the CEO participates in the market. If they don't feel confident in English, which again, in the Japanese example is real tough, the fluency was very, very difficult. I think that's a disadvantage. And then number three, it is around, understanding what it takes to go develop this market. So I've seen some really fantastic technology, for example, come out of Israel. Sometimes it's been underfunded as it pertains to sales and marketing, investment. And as you know, for a lot of cloud companies to develop and build here, it takes a lot of effort in terms of scale, headcount, marketing resources and dollars and so forth. So I'd say my advice would be, find that beacon leader and then ensure that you have full trust in that person to say, we're going to invest with gusto into this market, and make sure that you have the same wherewithal in your headquarters and your back office to support that go-to-market in the US. If you do, I think it's critical.
Awesome stuff. And everybody, if you're curious about a playbook around how to get into other markets, there's a recent book out there called Global Class. Abe, your fingerprints are all over this thing.
I love it.
In several sections, but a great, like really probably the Bible if you're going to think about doing an expansion.
Yes.
Long overdue for that book to come out. So Abe, let's shift to some questions. Put you on the hot
Sure.
seat. First one that's live. It's an outstanding question from Scott Edmonds at Syncery. He asks, in your opinion, has the last 3 years of remote work practices changed the strategy about a market entry / hub and spoke model?
Well, it's interesting because, and I know we're recording this. I'm going to say, first of all, I think people can absolutely do fantastic things as it pertains to developing any market, anywhere, anytime using Zoom. So I think you can build your entire go-to-market, whether it's sales, marketing, learning and development, anything you want on our technology. So please embrace it. That said, you got to get in the markets. So, as you're building foundational areas, your primary markets, your secondary markets, et cetera, I think there's a lot to be said about getting to know your hires, getting to know your partners, getting to know your customers, getting involved in the market, whether it's with analysts or media. And that does require you being, physically there from time to time. I think it's impossible to not have that as part of your consideration. We were lucky, before the pandemic, I was very active out in the markets, which seemed ironic for Zoom, but it made a lot of sense. And when everything shut down, we obviously knew how to use the tech to reach lots of people really effectively. And now that it's loosening them up, we're back out there. So I think it's a hefty balance.
Cool.
Yeah.
Got it. Let me go to one of the earlier submitted questions.
Sure.
Tactical. I love this. And because you talked about this a little bit of the 10 million, the 50 million, but when do you judge is the right time to explore entering a new market?
Well, I think too early is too dangerous. So, to the question that Neeraj posed, I do think you have to have a little bit of wind and critical mass in your sales. Like usually you see, the execution prowess in the United States, you see that first 10 million underfoot. When you think about, your markets, your first market, your second market, and so forth, I think they're the obvious ones. Like we talked about earlier, whether it's the UK or Australia, they're comfortable for most SaaS companies, and your executive team and your broader, organization will generally understand that, which is important. I'd say if you have another market that you're going to go identify early, there has to be a reason. Neeraj, to your point, maybe the product has a very certain appeal in India, or maybe it has a very certain appeal in the Middle East or otherwise, or maybe there's a competitive advantage or reason that the executive team can help on a market number 2 or 3 or 4. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to think about that. But you really have to have, your mapped out consideration of why am I doing this? And at the end of the day, ask yourself, if I'm doing it, is it going to drive more money and revenue for the company now than doing something else? And that could be domestic too. And that's the questions that we raise all the time. When I entered Zoom, I was real clear to Eric. I said, look, we're going to go build $1 billion business outside the United States. I didn't think we were going to do it in a year and a half, but I was confident we were going to go do it. And I was also very precise in what we asked of him and what we said we were going to go first, second, and third. And then he ripped up the plan and said, hey, go do 3 times that amount. And I think that's also another really important part of a CEO. It's like you want a CEO that's behind the mission and that really says, you know what, I'm not a weekend internationalist. I'm in this. I believe it. I understand it. I know it. And I want to do it. And I won't flinch because there's flinchable moments, not benchable moments. There's flinchable moments. So.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Real world experiences. I remember Marketo, we were closing in on 10 million. We were getting a lot of signals from Europe. We had customers. We had never done any marketing there, didn't have a soul on the ground there. And I remember going over Thanksgiving of 2009 to go interview some potential partners, interview some potential MDs, talk to customers, get a feel for the market. And I came back and the CEO said 3 words, I missed you. And I said, what does that mean? He said, we've been thinking about this all wrong. We don't own a space or a segment in the US yet. And so to distract us, he's like, I missed you because you weren't in the office. You weren't, creating energy. Yep. You weren't here with your team doing things. It's too early for us. And we held for 2 years. And what I'd say is we then went from would have been an early entrant to being a late entrant. but at that point, to what you said about momentum, we had planted the flag in the States on owning something.
Totally.
Really, really strong. So
And your machine, by the way, was so strong, like you could export it, which was also really powerful too.
great comment there. Abe, what are your thoughts on using like big level partners like the PwCs, the Deloittes, and the Accentures for global expansion? Pros and cons around that model.
I think for most early companies, don't fool yourself. They don't have time for you. So, and you don't have the depth for them. So, for a PwC or an Accenture or otherwise to build a practice around something, you have to have something really special that's absolutely crushing it already in the United States. And then you have to have the wherewithal and the strength of leadership and expertise to manage that practice. I think a Salesforce can do that. I think, a large tech company can do that. I think we're, even at Zoom stage, we're struggling to get that right. So I think it's tall order, really, for the global SIs. I think, you might find a boutique SI or somewhat of a regional SI that will have some disposition with you. Again, unless your product happens to be that unique product where it's an API driven product and they're going to build something special with your platform, maybe. I've never really seen it been, in my time, I haven't seen it be that effective.
Got it.
Yeah.
A question was pre-submitted, and I think I can anticipate your answer, but I'm curious. When launching your first international location, do you treat it as a startup within your startup?
I saw the question. I actually thought it was an interesting question. I actually don't like to think of international as like a startup. I like to think of it as it's a formidable part of the business. And we are going to invest in it and actually scale it like any other area. Like, so for example, at Zoom, we made a decision to go scale a product around phone. And today we have 5 million seats of phone 3.5 years later after launching the product's fast growing cloud PBX product in the history of cloud PBX. So, but when we said we were going to go launch that, it wasn't like, hey, this is an incubated startup inside the business. This is, we're going to go invest in this and this is going to be the next great thing. So I think you have to have let's put it this way, a startup mentality. So I think as you go into a country or you take that approach, I think you want to think like an entrepreneur. However, you also have to think like you're building something for scale, and that this is a core part of the business. So for example, when we entered into South Korea, we spent about a year planning for it. We established partnerships with Korea Telecom. We set the core team and market. We had foundational business in that country. It was already starting to produce the pre measurements that we expected. And we're not receding. We're going to continue to go into per the plan. So I think you got to think about it like a core part of the business.
Cool. Let's go into wind up mode here. I have one last one. It's a bit of a softball, seeing your international experience combined with your employer. But what is the best tip to increase collaboration over Zoom between international sales teams?
Well, first of all, use it all the time, right? So, I think you can create a lot of great relationships if you use video and you don't hide behind like a phone call or, you're just using your audio, et cetera. So I think video actually really does connect people in a way that you just can't experience otherwise. The other thing is, don't be afraid to use some of the advanced features that are there to make your life easier, like translation or transcriptions. So, we have live translation. Every time I address the Japanese team, even though I lived in Japan, I studied Japanese, I speak Japanese, we have live translation, right? So I want them to understand every word that we use in the platform. And then we also use the transcription feature. We want to make it easier for them, right? So I'd say use those functions. They're there for you to make international development easier. And then obviously the productivity tools like whiteboarding and, imagery like the emojis and so forth. Everybody understands what the heart looks like, or the thumbs up or so forth. So those are always good to break down borders and so forth. We're working on something to get rid of the time zone problem, but I don't know, somebody has to stay up late and somebody has to get up early, unfortunately.
Still do. Neeraj, anything?
Yeah, I have one question, Abe, just regarding Japan. A lot of our companies enter Japan via joint venture. And we'll sometimes bring in local money for that joint venture. Sometimes a firm like JCC to launch. Any pros and cons with this joint venture approach versus a fully owned thing with your own people? Could you share any comments on that?
I mean, look, I think there's absolute, validation that it works. If you look at, again, the Salesforce example, which is a classic early entrance with Sunbridge, look no further than Bill Binch and, Marketo and the wonderful JV that they established with Denso. I mean, that was a real strategic and a great leadership that helped devise that go to market. I think it can certainly work in a country like that for sure. Obviously, the key is to find the right partner. Companies like Japan Cloud, I think, are real focused on establishing those kinds of JVs and helping cloud companies develop in that market. And I think that's a fundamental option. We elected not to do that. We established our own KK, and Eric had a very, very strong belief in Japan. He had lived there. He had some early contacts and interests. Ultimately, we had a strong partnership with SoftBank, which really helped us accelerate in the market. So I think it's very viable for sure. I think for a country like Japan, and there's a proven path to do that.
Okay, great. Yeah. And
Yeah.
then you mentioned Eric. So I was, it's to me, like working with a great CEO is like a privilege. And I, spent a little time with Eric. I think he's, really special. But I'm curious, anything that you can point to that he did that really supported you in your mission to, I think, build now, was it $1 billion of ARR internationally, right? Or maybe more.
Yeah, $1.5 billion in revenue. It's about, we're approaching 40% of the business. So yeah, it's it's really grown nicely. I think, first of all, he had to get his head around the fact that it was time. It was interesting because we had a lot of trust. For Eric, the most important thing is speed of trust. And I was fortunate to have gotten to know him. And you're right, he's an exceptional leader on all fronts. And when the time was right for the company, I felt it, and ultimately he did too. And then when the trust and the timing met opportunity, i.e. the preparation for the IPO and then the IPO, and then obviously the necessity to grow outside the US, we leaned on one another. And I felt like, he always had confidence to say, go do this. And I want you to. But at the same token, he is extremely driven. So, every time we would have a projection, he's like, it's not good enough, right? So you can do better than that. So I think the sign also of a good leader is one that causes you to think harder, makes you to, challenge your, what you thought is possible. I had a really interesting conversation slightly before this call, and the discussion was around think bigger. Imagine if everybody in the country was using it. How do we do that? Now, those are not typical, CEO world. Sometimes, like, especially in this economy, people can be a little bit cautious, and we have to be real. But I think there's a real privilege for somebody that says, hey, look, go do this. I'm behind it. And by the way, you're going to get off easy. So if you're saying that it's time to go do this, I'm going to ask you for more. And he has the right to do that. So plus it's his company, so he has the right to do that.
Abe, I could easily continue this masterclass on global, but I want to thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
We do have, we've only been in business for 3 podcasts, but we have a small tradition here on Soundbites that for all our guests, we like to give a thank you, and you get your choice of a pair of Wayfarers or Aviators.
Ooh, hey, we're going around the world. It's got to be Aviators.
All right, yes. The whole team that produces this, we bet on what is gonna pick, and I nailed that one. So I think I'm 3 on the order.
Classic.
So, Abe, really, truly, again, as a friend and as a business colleague, I was really excited to have you join us on the Battery Soundbites webinar here and share your experience with all of our listeners. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. No, pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the chance to be included. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Really appreciate it.
Awesome.
My pleasure.
Take care.
Bye, guys.